What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Star-Lord, Master of the Sun, has released with a bang, and his deck has been getting more and more refined over time. Right now, he plays a little bit like a Mr. Negative deck with a lot more interactive pieces. A combo that is based off of having certain cards and then certain follow-ups to those cards. The biggest difference between the day one versions of Star-Lord and where we've arrived at now is there's just a lot less bad cards in them, and Arnim Zola has become an absolute star in the archetype, if you'll pardon the pun. Zola allows this deck to have all sorts of ridiculous pieces of output, whether that be a turn 4 Star-Lord into Zola with a Grandmaster for 3 procs of Star-Lord on turn 5, or things that are even weirder than that, like Aliothing multiple lanes on the final turn of the game, duplicating Fang Foom's. He is part of both your setup and your punchline here. You have a lot of things that are going for you. Now, this is still a bit of a one-trick pony of a deck. There are other things you can do, but they're not particularly things that keep you at a high level. At a baseline, what you're trying to do is play Star-Lord on 4 after playing off curve for 3 turns, unless you play a Luna Snow beforehand, in which case you play the Luna Snow on 3, Star-Lord on 4 floating 1, and it's kind of the same thing. Then what you do is you multiply Star-Lord's effect. Grandmaster, Absorbing Man, and Arnim Zola are the ways that you can do this. On the final turn of the game, you play a bunch of dumb stuff. Backup plan number 1 is you didn't draw Star-Lord by 4. If you draw him by 5, you can get to 11 energy and play something like Juggernaut and Fang Foom. That is your backup plan. Backup plan number 2 is you just sort of like wave out a Fang Foom and then Arnim Zola it later. This just kind of works for some reason. It just is a thing that works in a shocking amount of games, kind of like your own little Black Panther Zola built-in combo. Not a great game plan, but it does work. What you'll notice is that a lot of these cards require some things to actually happen. So a lot of the people that are counterplaying you are counterplaying you with Cosmo, they're counterplaying you with Supergiant, they're counterplaying you with Negasonic, they're counterplaying you with all sorts of things that interact with your ability for your cards to have text. And that's not to say that this isn't one of the best decks in the game, if not the best deck in the game. I'm talking about it here for a reason. It's probably the most defining thing happening in this metagame. But it's also not to say that there's nothing you can do when you're faced with it. Hydra Stomper Midrange has all the tools that it needs to meaningfully disrupt the play patterns that this card, Star-Lord, is trying to make happen. Now, first things first, you'll notice a Daredevil here and a Daredevil in the previous deck. This is because turn 5 is usually the pivotal turn. If you are able to Star-Lord on 4 and get off a good turn 5, it's very difficult to lose the game from there. Disrupting that is quite crucial. This deck is doing so with a variety of different strategies. You can blow up the Star-Lord with a cannonball because you will almost certainly have priority if you had an early game plan here and thus prevent them from doing their Zola, Grandmaster, Absorbing Man stuff. You can also mess things up with Cosmo and Negasonic in meaningful ways. This is a deck that just will not die. It adapted to Shou, although it did incorporate Shou, it's adapting now. The Batroc package is the safe refuge for anyone who is trying to play a normal game of Marvel Snap against this deck. You just have so many things that are favored for you in the matchup that I genuinely think that you are very much in the driver's seat when you run up against the Star-Lord deck. This deck even used to be playing Supergiant, and it doesn't even need it. That's the crazy thing about this. This was originally like, let's get Supergiant in here, tech against the Star-Lord deck. We don't even need it, genuinely. That is how good this deck is in that matchup. Alternate build here from Derek. Same kind of premise here. The decks are built on doing the same thing, but instead of having, just Cosmo in here and maybe the potential for a Mercury Cannonball, there is also just, we're going to have priority on turn 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to Cosmic Ghost Rider their Star-Lord. And okay, they had a good turn 5. They had the 8 energy on the turn 5. but they don't get the 25 energy on the final turn of the game because they're not actually going to be able to meaningfully Grandmaster or Zola or duplicate it in any kind of way. And if that's not happening, then I think you're just probably fine to win this game with a normal kind of scalar game plan. That's the biggest thing about this, is I think a lot of people are just letting Star-Lord happen to them instead of actually meaningfully disrupting it. Take priority, make the final turn not happen, you're going to win the game. And they're very confident in this stuff. This is a big part of why I had the Daredevil in the Star-Lord deck, is because basically everyone who is meaningfully disrupting that deck is going to do it on 5. They're going to prevent you from snowballing further. The way the Star-Lord deck plays out is you play the Star-Lord on 4 and then you do more with it on 5. If that doesn't happen, you're just a normal ass deck. And you will lose to a good scaler like this. It's extremely real. Another very real way to damage Star-Lord decks is with the classic Supergiant Dragon of the Moon list. Master Mold is a ridiculously good card in the matchup because basically every single version of the Star-Lord list is skipping every single turn until turn 4 or sometimes 3 with a Luna Snow. You are going to prevent them from drawing cards, and there's a lot of cards with even costs. Basically, every time I've seen a Dragon of the Moon played in the matchup, it's like 12 power, just on the board, not counting the fact that it's stealing power. Just on the board, it says 12 power. This is also a deck with Supergiant to able to prevent the deck from snowballing further. It is a deck with Negasonic. It is a deck with Cosmo. It has tools on tools on tools on tools to win the matchup. A very straightforward and probably the easiest deck to pilot in the matchup, the one that will ask the absolute least of you. You will only ever have to guess what's going on under the stuff. That is the only thing you will actually have to figure out. One thing that is notable here is I've been very not impressed with Shadow King, and I do wonder if there is a better option there. I think he covers enough theoretical other stuff that I haven't gotten to the point of cutting him, but I have been very, very unimpressed with him. A lot of people reacted pretty negatively to the Shou nerf. The most common refrain was, I don't think this is enough. And I would like everyone to keep that in mind when we talk about what might need to happen to Star-Lord. I've seen some very drastic takes about Star-Lord that I think are very much over the top. Shou lost 2 points of power, and the rest of its deck lost maybe 3 more. It is now a very average and fine deck. When you take enough power off of a card or out of an archetype, it gets meaningfully worse. I see people talking about how Star-Lord is unfixable. I promise you, if you take 5 power off of that card, it is going to be terrible. In fact, if you take 2 power off of that card, it is a lot worse. I bring this up to say that Shou is a very viable deck, but it's hard for it to figure out what it's supposed to be doing because it doesn't outpower the Star-Lord stuff. So it needs to be a bit of a tech deck with things like Cosmo and Supergiant and Cosmic Ghost Rider in the list in order to make this work. It's also possible that instead of being a Maverick list, we need to be a Werewolf list in order to facilitate that stuff. This stuff has mostly not been figured out yet. We are in a bit of a brave new world. But one of the things I really want to stress to people is that Star-Lord is a solvable problem. And I think a lot of people are acting like there is nothing they can possibly do about the guy when there really very much is a lot of the time. And it might even involve an old villain becoming the hero, but I think there's a lot of meaningful disruption that you can do. The preponderance of Supergiant and Stardust also does a lot to take care of decks that are doing things like the Hela MODOK stuff. I think people will be surprised that that list is not on the tier list. That's because it's not good. Sorry. It's not very good. Like that is a low elo terror. For people that aren't prepared for it, you should never lose more than 4 cubes to that deck, and frankly, you should probably never lose more than 2. It is fine, but it is functionally Galactus. You will be okay. That is a very real thing where, like, if you are prepared for this kind of stuff, you have the Stardust here that is enabling you to deal with the Zola plays. That's a really good thing to do. You have the super giant decks that we just talked about that turn off the Hela stuff as well. I think that largely there is a lot more coverage for this card than people act like there is. Probably the best way to, like, hard counter these decks is Jean Grey Cosmo. It's a weird thing, and there's still a lot to be found out about what exactly a good Jean Grey Cosmo list looks like. A bunch of high-level players have been messing around with a bunch of different stuff. This is Derek's list. I think it is a reasonable shout here, where, again, if you want a deck that's just like, I cannot lose to this matchup, this is the deck. All you got to do is prevent them from doing their Mr. Negative, and you're going to win the game. Again, people are acting like this is, oh, it's impossible. You can't stop it. And it's like, yeah, you can. You can. You can actually stop it. You can make this not happen. And if they don't do their dumb energy thing, they don't do anything. It is actually genuinely unbeatable. Like, I really cannot stress this enough. If you play Jean Grey Cosmo with priority, they lose. I have, in my time playing the Star-Lord deck, never beaten it. Not one time. I have never beaten it. I've tried all sorts of stuff. I have never done it. It has not happened. You cannot beat it. If you want to beat up on that deck, you got it. This is it. This is another version I've kind of been kicking around with the thesis of, like, I kind of just want this deck to work and be like a functional thing that doesn't necessarily lean entirely on the combo of Jean and Cosmo to, like, have a game plan and can also, like, you know, be a normal Shou-Batroc deck. I think this deck might be doing a little too much. I think maybe the Shou stuff might need to go out. I think maybe the Maverick stuff, like Shou Maverick, a little bit iffy. Not sure about that. But again, the baseline here is you are a very good deck already. And if you play Jean Cosmo, you cannot lose to a Star-Lord. It just genuinely, you cannot lose. It will not happen. And so this enables you to have a powerful scaling early game, Batroc, and of course, Sam Wilson, about as good as it gets, and also a backup in the late game with potentially the most overpowering matchup against anyone doing Star-Lord stuff that exists in the entire game. Ongoing stuff is pretty good, but it is one of those decks that got worse as the Star-Lord decks were able to do things like have a bunch of Alioths. Like, before that sort of thing picked up, I think this deck was a much more reasonable counter. But now it's another one of these decks where Cosmo is sort of paramount. And if you don't have Cosmo and they're able to do something really stupid, they're probably going to Alioth you to death and then play some other big guys on the final turn of the game, which is not a great situation to be in. The big difference between something like Mr. Negative and something like Star-Lord is that when you want to beat Mr. Negative, your tech card works retroactively. And if you want to beat Star-Lord, it's actually got to be there on time. And I think that that is a meaningful advantage that Star-Lord holds. And Star-Lord, of course, also has, like, you know, more interactive tools, but functionally it's kind of doing the same thing. And I think that this deck is a deck that if I were recording this video 2 or 3 days ago, I would have a worse build of Star-Lord and this deck would be much higher on the list. But I have a better build of Star-Lord now, and so this deck is much lower on the list. Doom 2099 is playable. I've seen a couple different versions of the build, and I haven't really found one that really sells me on it. Like, you are pretty vulnerable to Alioth and things that are going to, like, Zola you. You're not exactly immune to that kind of stuff. They go bigger than you a lot of the time. There's stuff here. I've seen versions that are like Aurora with Cosmo, and I almost wonder if that makes sense in this shell too, but maybe it's just better off being the Aurora Jean Grey Cosmo deck that we talked about earlier. This is the kind of thing where if you're not playing against the big bad evil guy, you kind of do a lot of work by just curving out and play a real normal game of Marvel Snap. There just aren't too many normal games of Marvel Snap. But what you can do when you play this deck is beat the living hell out of all the people who are trying to counter this stuff. The more people who get zoned into countering Star-Lord, the more people that are going to be playing a lot of stuff that just lose to this deck on points. And that is also meaningful. Like when you look at what people have to do to beat Star-Lord, it's doable, but it does take some sacrifice, which is why I've been messing around with that Shou version so that we have like a functioning game plan even when that doesn't happen. I think there's a lot of potential there. I just haven't gotten fully there. And right now, this deck is just beating up things that aren't able to compete with it on points, which is a lot of the decks that are countering Star-Lord. The same goes for the ramp list. Like, I think this deck is fine. You just kind of get like pounded by Star-Lord because they do what you're doing, but more of it. And that's really the only matchup that's bad. Like, I really can't stress this enough. This deck has like very good matchups across the board and then cannot beat a Star-Lord in a million years. Again, it's because Star-Lord is functionally a Mr. Negative deck where like that's how it plays. And this deck could never beat Mr. Negative. And when it's doing something like what Star-Lord is doing, it really can't beat that. So it's less a problem of like Star-Lord is broken and more a problem of like the Season Pass card is the exact kind of card this deck is fundamentally incapable of competing with on power. Like you see stuff like this and like Thanos and like these are decks that just, if they get the combo happening to them, it is really bad. I've seen people doing like Thanos with Super Giant and Cosmo and it's like, all right, you're doing the most. Like you gotta stop. Like there has to be a better way to make this happen, right? Maybe Thanos is our Jean Grey Cosmo deck, but I think the problem is you really want to have access to those cards. And you end up with a deck like this that is genuinely just good. It's good in every other matchup, but it gets Mr. Negative really badly when you run up against Star-Lord. Denish Hela is honestly quite solid right now. A card that is genuinely really good into Star-Lord decks is Gambit. That's a card that I think people haven't been leaning enough on, but very often the Star-Lord might be the first or maybe second thing that they play, depending on how their draw goes. If you blow up the Star-Lord, you basically cannot lose. There's a lot of this kind of stuff. Again, it's why I'm running Daredevil in the Star-Lord deck, because you have, you know, I'm going to Gambit the Star-Lord. I'm going to Mercury Cannonball the Star-Lord. I'm going to Cosmic Ghost Rider the Star-Lord. I'm going to Cosmo the Star-Lord lane. All of this stuff exists that is built on counterplaying that turn 5. And so that's the importance of the Daredevil here. But that counterplay still beats you. Like, it's still going to beat you most of the time. You just know it's happening. And so that kind of stuff is what the Daredevil is bringing to the list. Sometimes you're going to be able to play around it. Sometimes you're not. But largely, this kind of stuff is what you have to look out for. And so when you're able to, like, Gambit a Star-Lord, they're dead. The biggest thing you have going against you is that I think Stardust is a much more popular card than it previously was. But in terms of the Star-Lord matchup, you not only have Gambit, you also have Supergiant. You just get to do stuff to them. Like, you have a lot of play in that matchup, and you can do a lot of powerful stuff. And we've talked about how many of the decks trying to beat Star-Lord are these like smaller mid-rangey decks. These sort of vaguely like relatively low to the ground decks that are leveraging things like Jean Grey Cosmo. You don't want to see a Jean Grey Cosmo, don't get me wrong. But there is just kind of a lot of like, ooh, I'm a Batroc deck. And it's like, well, if I'm playing Hela, I'm going to beat a Batroc deck. I feel good about that. Magik On 5 is another way you can deal with the play patterns that Star-Lord creates. And frankly, it's just a whole archetype of decks that got a lot better when people stopped playing only Shou decks. There's just a lot less Merlin running around. This stuff is a lot safer. And Magik On 5 is meaningfully good into the Star-Lord stuff because they are building for a giant energy turn 6. So you're able to do a lot of work there. Again, a lot of the way people beat the Star-Lord decks is counterplaying on 5. We talked about the Daredevil already, but this is just yet another reason why it matters. This is a baseline deck that I wish I didn't have to run Cosmo in. Like, the biggest thing that the Star-Lord decks do that's annoying is that they get to be like Alioth Juggernaut decks. And so you just have to be a Cosmo deck if you want to be a Tribunal deck, and it's the biggest pain in the ass. But it is still good enough to win. Like, don't get me wrong. The other problem this deck has is if you're Cosmoing, they could just make 2 lanes with like 45 power, and you might not be able to Tribunal over the top of that because you have to use the Cosmo lane. It does make your whole deal just a lot more awkward than it otherwise would be. I do think this deck does some really legitimate stuff. I worry, though, that once people figure out the sort of Daredevil Alioth version of the Star-Lord list, which I think they probably will, is the first deck in this video, stuff like this gets meaningfully worse. Everything I said about Tribunal is also true of Zombie Galacti. It's just a deck that is sort of opting into very awkward situations when there's a very real world where they can just Alioth all 3 lanes with priority against you. You feel bad when that happens. It's bad. It's not good. It's just not a good feeling, and you don't get to play nearly as much counterplay to it. They could actually just go over the top of you. It's sort of odd because the Magic decks were very good previously and held down by Merlin, and now Magic is actively good in terms of how the metagame is shaping up, and there just aren't people counterplaying it, but the decks got worse. It's a weird situation. You know, we always end the tier list talking about Destroy. And I think that it's become something of a meme. But I sat in a Discord call with Honifer, and we played this deck for like 2 hours, and he climbed all the way up to rank 2. And that's not to say, wow, Destroy is amazing, or anything like that. But I do think that there is something to the idea that this is a pretty meaningfully powerful thing to be doing in a world where people are doing a lot of Fang Foom. It's not the greatest thing in the world now that people are adapting with a million Cosmos. That's definitely problematic for you, especially if the Jean Grey Cosmos stuff picks up. It's not ideal. But you are just a deck that can, with its good draws, output pretty massive numbers of points, with most of those points being un-Fang Foomable and face down. That is relevant, and I think it also speaks to what it is to beat a Star-Lord deck and what it is to deal with all this kind of stuff. Because what Destroy has always been held back by is lack of access to its best draws. And that is still true, but there are a lot of decks that are held back by that now. If you're just going to lose to Star-Lord, that's just kind of how everything is. And so Destroy actually felt pretty legit, honest to God. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is the Rosetta Stone to understanding the metagame, but I do think that just doing an unconscionably large amount of points is a pretty reasonable thing to do. Like, it's very possible that there's just a lot of overthinking here, where it's like, okay, I thought too much about I need to go into the weeds to play Jean Grey Cosmo to beat the Star-Lord stuff. And it's like, I wonder how many decks there are that can go power to power. I know Destroy on a good draw can. It just absolutely can. And that is a really interesting dynamic, because I wonder if that means that there are other decks in this space that are able to go power to power. What Destroy has going for it is that a lot of its cards are not getting Alioth on the final turn of the game, and they're not getting Fang Foomed on the final turn of the game. It's a unique dynamic because a lot of its cards are being popped back into hand. That's rare. Not a lot of other decks are like that, but it does sort of make me wonder about what could have been. If we still had a 1-2 Human Torch, is Move Bounce the kind of thing that works? Maybe the Alioth is a lot better there. I'm not sure. But this is one of those cases where the fact that this is scaling turn over turn, Deadpool, is actually beneficial because he doesn't need his text on the final turn of the game. That's a weird spot to be in, but it is true. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And before I end, I'm going to remind you to like and subscribe, of course. But I do want to talk a little bit about Star-Lord because I've been a little disappointed in the community and generally the sort of complain first, figure it out later mentality. I'm not going to sit here and say that Star-Lord is not an extremely powerful card, but I think there's a thing that's happening where people think that any card that is good is way better than it actually is. Star-Lord is a really good card. Shou was a really good card. I cannot tell you how many times in the history of Marvel Snap I've heard something like, this card is not fixable, and then the card loses 2 power and it's totally fine. You hear that all the time. It is constant. I promise you, Star-Lord is a fixable problem. And that's if he even is one. I personally think it's potentially true. I would argue even likely that he is. But people really love rushing to judgment on stuff like this because it's easier to look back and say, I was right earlier than it is to, do the alternative and take a little bit of time and actually try to beat the card. I want to give a lot of kudos to the people at the top of Infinite, because when I started playing Star-Lord, it's ready to test for this video, I ran into a bunch of people who were like, I am countering this deck. I am going to beat your ass. And I think that that might not be a healthy thing for a metagame to be long-term, but there are definitely more clear counters to this than there ever were to Shou Lao. I do think that's really important. Shou Lao was a deck that was also a very good mid-range deck. It was not just a deck that was the combo, it was also very good at being a powerful mid-range game plan. So when you weren't Shou Laoing, you were still doing strong things. This deck is kind of one note. And if you can put that one note underwater, mixing metaphors here, you are going to do well against it. I'm not saying it isn't strong. I'm definitely not saying that. But I do think that in terms of like balance issues, Shou Lao presented a lot more. That was a deck that was much harder for you actually have something that you were confident beats it. I talked about 5 decks I'm pretty sure are good into this deck today. There are options out there, and I really think that it's probably worth chilling out just a little bit. This card is extremely strong and does very broken stuff, but all I can think of is how would people react if they printed Mr. Negative today? I would imagine a lot of the same things being said about Star-Lord would be said about that card, and it's a totally fine card. Again, Star-Lord is better. This card is very good. I would not be surprised if it got nerfed. But I really would like people to be a little bit more realistic about what this card actually is. As always, thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest, and I'll see you in the next one.